We're trying to understand the conception of humanism, and this quotation from the French philosopher Alain Renaud, I think, nails the conception very well. And so we'll look at his quotation. This is from Charles Taylor's Secular Age. So he has quoted the French quotation, and then it looks like Charles Taylor's translation. But so, what is humanism? Humanism. Fundamentally, humanism is the conception. Humanism is the conception and valorization of humanity in its capacity for autonomy. So, humanism is, first of all, it is valorization of humanity, la valorisation de la humanité, in its capacity for autonomy. So autonomy is a important concept, but first we look at valorization as such. So valorization of humanity. So humanism, we are trying to understand what is humanism. And one thing this quotation tells us, that humanism, to understand humanism, we need to understand autonomy, the concept of autonomy, because it is through the conception of autonomy that modern humanism is defined. But generally speaking, humanism is valorization of humanity. Valorization is of humanity. Valorization of humanity. And valorization of humanity can be humanity as, every individual as an individual, and humanity as a species. So then this will, result in the development of different types of humanism, individualistic humanism and species-based humanism. But the important point here is to understand. So first thing about humanism is it's a valorization. Valorization, well, I mean worth. So enhancing the worth of humanity. And I think more appropriate way to define it is to exaggerate the value of humanity, which is another way of saying is, if we define justice as putting everything in its place, meaning in its place, due place, where it belongs. That would be justice. So basic injustice of humanity, humanism would be to attribute to humanity power, and that can be potential and actual power. But potential power would be important, because one of the points or one of the claims of modern humanism is that humanity's potential has been retarded due to false ideas, especially due to religious ideas or due to philosophies. So both old philosophies like naturalism and cosmic philosophies, as well as religious philosophies like Christianity or Judaism, etc. And the same would be said about Islam and other religions later. So, power of humanity, so exaggerating the power of humanity, worth of the humanity, and the value of humanity. So that's the basic valorization. So elevating humans to a station which is way beyond the real station. Obviously, that is contentious. A station as, creature among other creatures with potential and with deficiencies and all that. So exaggerating, so putting humanity beyond where it is. In a sense, this valorization can be really historically described as putting humanity in place of God. And in a sense, you require the death of God in order for humanism to emerge. Not just literally, factually, but you may reject God, but even if you don't reject that God, humanism requires that God be in service. God is in service of humanity, rather other way around. God-like, and obviously religions, especially Christianity, even though they are in a sense non-humanistic, anti-humanistic religions in the modern sense of the word, but they also paved the way for humanism because they gave the idea of man, God, and all those things. So this is the basic valorization of putting humanity in place of a God. So in that sense, humanism requires the death of God, factually or at least normatively, or at least the death of the traditional Judeo-Christian God. And that's why humanism wouldn't have been possible without God, because if you didn't have a conception of God, you wouldn't have humanism in that sense as well. Okay, so that's the basic stuff. So the humanism is valorization of humanity, but the form that valorization takes in modernity, for example, is the valorization of human capacity for self-determination or autonomy. So autonomy is the concept through which this valorization of humanity is basically conceptualized in modern period. This valorization of humanity is conceptualized through the conception of autonomy in modernism anyway. Autonomy. The capacity what makes humans godlike or God is their capacity for self-determination. That's autonomy. That is, they determine their own values, course of their life. And self-determination can be understood in two ways. In order to determine your own self, you need to come out of dependence. So dependence on others. It can be dependence on God or gods. It can be dependence on nature. So you need a power. You need a power. Power in two ways. You need a capacity to get out of the dependence. And capacity, the human must have that capacity, or at least is able to develop that capacity. So that's where potentially and actuality and their dynamic comes, but they also should have will. That is, they should recognize that this is what is important, and that's it. So it's both a question of fact and norm. So normatively, they should believe that they shouldn't be dependent on nature. They shouldn't be dependent on other creatures. They shouldn't be dependent on God. They shouldn't be dependent on anything outside them. So that's a normative thing. And once they have this will, that will is not enough because they still need capacity to come out of dependence. You can have all the will, but if you don't have a capacity to come out of this dependence, then nothing is going to. So that's the dependence part. And once you have come out of dependence, then you can become independent. So then again, for independence, you need both two things. You need capacity for independence, capacity to determine yourself, positive capacity, it's not just coming out of. And you also need another will and value to determine your own life, because you might have a will to get out of dependence, but at least in principle you can have that will and not have the positive will. So although it's hard to imagine what form it will take, except for laziness. So your capacity, so what makes human godlike or God is their capacity for autonomy, that is, their capacity for self-determination. That is their capacity to determine their own self. And this capacity for self-determination requires, again, first you need to get out of dependence. And to get out of dependence, you need first a will, or a normative concept that you shouldn't be dependent on others. And the other thing is, then you should have a capacity, potentially or actuality, to come out of it. And once you are out of it, then you can worry about actually establishing your independence in a positive sense, that determining your own life, now that it is not dependent on other. So here again you need two things. You need a will, that like a normative conception, that's what should be the case, and once you have that, then you need resources, that is capacity against either potentially or actuality. So this is the conception of, so humanism is the valorization of humanity. And as I said, this can be either in humanity in individuality or humanity as a species. We won't go into that yet. And this is understood in terms of the concept of autonomy. And autonomy is a concept which can be self-determination, and it has two horns, dependence and independence, and both horns need will and capacity. And that's what defines modern humanism, according to Alain Renaud here, and it is generally in line with what is understood as humanism. So humanism, modern humanism. And this modern humanism defines our modernity or modern age because it is different from Greek conception, Aristotle, etc., who were talking about reason and all that, but reason for them was a cosmic reason. A human has some sort of dignity as the bearer of those reasons, but they didn't conceive humans as humanity is as being defined as the capacity to self-determination, or in this modern subjective sense. We'll come to that, and it's also distinguished from Christianity, for example. Even though Christianity was very important for for the development of humanism, but Christianity itself is not humanism, because what it teaches is that humans' will should be subservient to that of God. So that is basically not autonomy, that is heteronomy against autonomy, really. And man is subservient to God. So Christian humanism in that sense is very different from modern humanism. Yeah. So I think it's still, there's a lot of stuff in this quotation, so we'll look at it in the next video.